Hi, welcome everybody. My name is Grace Bubeck, and this is an event with Craig Holliday on opening to the shadow. I'll just introduce Craig quickly. Let me bring up his bio here. Craig Holliday is a gifted spiritual teacher trained in both the yogic and Buddhist traditions, a founding member of the Association for Spiritual Integrity, and a licensed professional counselor offering mindfulness-based and non-dual therapy. He is the author of Fully Human, Fully Divine, which I enjoyed reading the last week. His work is dedicated to the discovery of our innate divinity and the expansion of compassion on the planet. He works in a way that addresses our everyday suffering as a doorway to our inherent freedom and empowerment. He lives with his wife and 2 daughters in Durango, Colorado, and meets with individuals from around the world online and in workshops and retreats. And you'll find his bio and website, craigholliday.com, on the event page for this online event on living-from-love.com. Whoops. All right. So thank you for joining us for this, Craig. I really resonate with your approach and perspective, and the very embodied way of sharing and teaching that you have. So it felt very appropriate to do something on the shadow with you, which is this human condition we all face as human beings. You know, we face dealing with parts of our psyche that are not as bright and loving and compassionate as we would like them to be. So, Craig, I thought we'd start by just you sharing with us what your definition of the shadow is.
Yeah, sure, Grace. So, hello, everyone, and thank you, Grace, so much for having me. I feel really, really honored to be here. So I just wanted to start with a thank you.
Oh, well, thanks to you too, Craig.
Yeah, of course.
I feel equally honored.
Yeah, good. So, shadow is something that can't be summed up in a short definition. Shadow is something that we spend our whole life studying and exploring. And so if I step back, really far and just look at, well, what is shadow? Like from a very wide perspective, shadow is simply the evolutionary nature of God. It's like our evolving edge. And it's not just for us humans, it's for this whole universe. This whole universe has an evolving edge, and we are all evolving out of something which is lesser into something greater. And by something lesser, I mean, the whole world is growing into greater and greater complexity, greater and greater expressions of divinity. And so, when the world was first created after the Big Bang, or even if I just take a step back and say, with the, at one point God was just vast, spacious emptiness. And she said, well, maybe I'll create a world that evolves. And so with the Big Bang, came, the stars, the planets, and life has just been evolving, to greater and greater degrees. And so shadow work is a willingness to evolve. This is what it means to do shadow work. So more specifically, shadow work is, or the shadow is all the unconscious and repressed aspects of our psyche. And so if we just look at that, kind of in reference to what I was speaking about before, it's basically our repressed animal nature and repressed aspects of our human self that our ego or our superego does not like. And so say, for example, most of us, if we're good spiritual people, like a good Buddhist or a good Christian, we might repress our anger. We might repress, grief. We might repress our nature, like our desire nature. These are really common things that people repress. And then we tend to get in trouble because we repress. So the way, we live in an energetic universe. And, what we are is we are pure energy. And anytime you repress energy, you create a shadow. In fact, I could back that up a little bit further and say, anything that has a form is going to have some level of shadow, any form can always grow into something greater. And so when we have something like, say, for example, anger, like that's something I'm intimately familiar with within my shadow. As a kid, I often experienced myself as really sensitive, really soft, really gentle. But there was this other side of me that could be, quite angry. And, as I grew on the spiritual path, I tried to repress the anger because the anger reminded me of my father, and he kind of had a dominating presence in my life. And so I repressed this within me. But anytime you disown an aspect of your humanity or even your divinity, this pressure starts to build within oneself. And so when you repress aspects of your psychology, a shadow develops, like with me, my shadow was, I'm going to be a good, disciplined, like monk kind of guy, where I'm just going to meditate as hard as I can and keep all my emotions within me. But then I noticed that those emotions started to come out in neurotic ways. I would have, big bouts of anger that I struggled with, or I'd have desire or overwhelming feelings of sadness. And so instead of looking at those feelings directly and owning them and working with them, I repress them through discipline in order to, maintain a disciplined persona. And so there's, 1,000,001 ways that this, that our shadow arises in our life. But basically, our shadow puts this veil between us and our humanity, and a veil between us and a buried aspect of our divinity. And so let me clarify a little bit about that, Grace. Let me finish this one thought, and then we'll chat a little bit. Oftentimes, people think of shadow work as like dirty work. It's like doing like the dirty psychological work. But if you look at, say, the qualities of true nature is not just vast and spacious and free. Those are some of the qualities of it. But true nature is also kind and loving, compassionate, and powerful. When we repress our humanity, and we just try to, like hang out in heaven, we are ignoring different qualities of our own divinity. And so through embracing something like anger or sadness, we start to discover these other qualities of divinity, such as compassion and love, or unconditional love, or strength. And when we ignore this, when we ignore an aspect of ourself or an aspect of our divinity, we're going to find ourselves in some kind of trouble. Because one of the things that God, life, evolution does not like is being ignored. So if there's aspects of divinity that are ignored, there's normally a revolt within us. And that revolt creates a big mess in our life. And then that big mess creates the opportunity for evolution to grow into something greater. And so I'll stop talking, Grace, and I apologize for interrupting you. So if you have a question about any of that, I know that was kind of a lot there.
Yeah, Yeah. It's good to kind of put all this out there, because that is your perspective. That is how you see the shadow. And that's what I asked of you.
Yeah.
So let me, what I hear, Craig, is two things. One is a more, I don't know, maybe psychological model, which talks about the shadow as that which is repressed. Which is kind of traditional psychology that goes back to, I guess, Freud. And so energetically, you're right, there's something that wants to move, that wants to be expressed. And there's another part of ourselves that says, no, this is not okay. So, it's kind of put on hold. Now, so that means the shadow is what is repressed, right? You also mentioned something much wider, which is, anything that is embodied has a shadow. So I'm not sure exactly, do you mean to really talk about the shadow as more of as the more traditional way of talking about it in a psychological way of repression? Or do you mean to talk of it as a much wider phenomenon that's really part of everything that's embodied? Because that's also what you said.
Absolutely. Anything which is embodied is subject to the laws of evolution. Basically anything that's embodied is subject to growth. And that's one of the aspects of God. Like, most people think of God as like vast innate perfection, but that's just half of God. The other half of God is giving birth into form, and this absolute movement of growth. If you look at growth, it's a movement of intelligence. And so if God is not a movement of intelligence, then we have a God that's void-like and meaningless. And so I like to look at, with anything in life, I always like to look at, why did God create this? How is this an aspect of God? Like, so many people on the spiritual path see that ego is the main obstacle to realizing God or divinity. But ego it's actually a step forward. It's an aspect of God consciousness that's a step forward out of animal nature. So when you're, like a lower level animal, you don't necessarily have an ego. And so an ego is a step forward out of animal nature. It's getting closer to a more divine incarnation of divinity, but it's still all divine, So the ego is a creation of God. Evolution is God, literally giving birth to herself. And so, I like to connect all the dots. One of the ways, one of the perspectives I teach from is from non-duality. Within non-duality, a true non-duality is inclusive of all of life. It doesn't just say God is non-dual and everything else is not. True non-duality looks at everything and includes everything and finds the divinity in it.
I have no, I'm totally with you on the non-dual perspective. I guess I'm just trying to clarify, like, say, for a lot of spiritual people, the ego becomes that which is not okay, so it's almost like the ego gets repressed. And you're very right that
Yes.
the ego actually has, it just has a function of seeing us through life. It's like, it has a perfectly functional aspect for us as human beings. And at the same time, that's what I'm trying to clarify. Like for spiritual people, it comes to be almost like equivalent with the shadow, because as spiritual people, often we actually try to repress the ego.
Yes.
So, maybe it doesn't matter exactly.
No, I think what you're bringing.
Shadow, but the point is, there's something about this tendency to want to repress because it's not okay.
Yeah.
And the need finally, in our spiritual opening and growth to really open to everything, literally everything that is there. And that includes the anger and the ego that's not okay, seemingly. And to kind of maybe just trust that all of this has its place.
Yes.
And it's actually the repression that creates the problem, because that creates energetically like a contraction and an accumulation of energy that at some point is just going to explode in our faces.
Exactly. One of the ways that I like to look at this is, again, with the evolutionary model, if you look at, well, how do I actually grow on a spiritual path? And so the traditional teachings are, you surrender everything and just, give your life to God. And, if that works, that's beautiful. But what most of us find, we're finding this more and more in the modern age, especially with the internet and the flow of information. You see that, well, look at the Catholic Church. His priest gives everything to God. They repress their desiring nature. And then there's this explosion, because there's this neurotic quality that's split off. There's this energy within them that's not being fully met, fully integrated. Same is true with, yogic teachers, Buddhist teachers. I mean, there's been scandals in every great tradition the last 3 months. It's ridiculous how much of this comes into the light. And, what I see God is doing is God is, trying to wake up on all levels of existence, not just in our absolute nature, but in our human nature, and to help grow our human nature in a fuller and fuller way. And so if we look at, well, how does growth happen? So with shadow work, we could say, okay, I notice my ego. I notice there's an aspect of my superego that wants to repress my animal nature. And if I can just keep it all repressed in me, and just focus on God, then I will realize my true nature and everything will be perfect. But it doesn't work. What happens is we can realize our true nature often in a temporary way. But as soon as we have to become embodied, be in relationship, pay your taxes, deal with money, deal with other human beings here on planet Earth, it doesn't work to ignore reality. It doesn't work. And if you look at God being love, love doesn't ignore. Love includes. Love is willing to walk in the direction of pain. And so if we want to talk about true freedom is not just spacious and empty, free. True freedom also means we have the freedom to look, to see what's within us, to meet it with love. To meet it with love. And so what happens with the ego is the ego actually grows and evolves with love. It's just like a child. The more you love yourself, the less the ego becomes a problem. The more you ignore yourself and attack yourself and repress yourself, the bigger ego you're going to have. But if you love yourself literally to death, the ego feels safe and it actually relaxes and starts to trust and let go into this greater expression of divine mind and divine heart. It actually surrenders on its own accord. It's like when you have a good mother and you trust your mother. As a kid, it's easy just to relax around her and to surrender into her love, into her heart. The same is true with the heart of God. And so it's through this doorway of humility, not repression, that we actually grow on the path. Now, repression works temporarily, which is confusing to people. Like when I was a good, student of yoga and meditating 4 hours a day, I was repressing everything and focusing all my energy on God. That was a helpful first step, but that's not a good lifelong way to practice spirituality on the path. If your spirituality does not include heart, if it does not include strength, if it doesn't know how to work with tremendous emotions or animal drives, then we'll get ourselves in a lot of trouble. A lot of trouble. Any human being on planet Earth is always going to get in a little trouble. That's how we grow. It's one of the ways we grow. So I don't ever want to paint a picture of you can get to a place where you live perfectly, because that would be to imagine that you're greater than the evolutionary nature of God. That's another shadow of divinity, of the spiritual path, is that we think we've outsmarted evolution. We have our life all wrapped up. And so it's important to look. If you look at qualities of awareness, honesty is a willingness to look inside and say, oh, there's aspects of myself that are really angry, that are sad, that are hurting, that feel rejected or abandoned. And the more you honestly open to those things, your awareness actually grows in an embodied way. So your awareness, it becomes greater. It becomes more loving. Your heart starts to wake up through the willingness to look at shadow. Some people are afraid, if I open that door, it's going to overwhelm me. And so then you have to learn, through shadow work, to develop what we call in Zen, like a backbone, a willingness to sit with something really intense, something difficult that you don't want to see. I was working with someone a few weeks ago, and, basically I just looked at her heart, and I said, what's there? And she's like, I don't want to look there. Why do you want me to look there? And she got really angry. I said, what's there? What's in your heart? As we opened to it, there's this tremendous pain in her heart. She didn't want to talk about that. But if we want to grow, if we want to heal our wounds, we have to look where we don't want to look. And this is what the shadow is. A shadow, it's almost like this energy that covers up our unconsciousness. And, it's the willingness to look at the shadow, just say, what's there? What's there? And so when I say anything that has a form has a shadow, I mean, anything that has a form, your humanity, just anything within you can have a greater expression, a lesser expression, an unconscious expression, an animal nature expression. And being consciously on the spiritual path is you're saying, I'm willing to open, I'm willing to look, I'm willing to be honest, I'm willing to evolve, even if it's difficult. Even if it's difficult.
Craig, I'm wondering whether, would this be a way of looking at it that might be helpful, that kind of integrates the spiritual with the psychological. The fact is, as we grow up, the love in which we grow up is bound to be conditional. So as we grow up, because none of our parents were totally unconditionally loving, they didn't know how to, I don't know anybody who grew up with parents who were really unconditionally loving. So love has conditions, and the conditions mean that we learn to suppress certain impulses in ourselves as children because we know they're not okay. If we express those, we won't get loved. So the shadow gets created, because there is an imperfection of love in our environment. And so somehow when we do the shadow work, it's like we have to bring love, the love that we didn't receive as children. We have to find that love. We have to, we learn to be that love in relation to that which has been suppressed.
Absolutely.
It had to be suppressed when we grew up. And so, in my own case, actually, a lot of this work was not done at a spiritual level, but to start with at a psychological level, because I was in psychotherapy. I had 9 years of psychotherapy because my childhood was very painful. And at some point, things just started collapsing and I knew I needed help. So at that point, all I knew was to go to see a psychotherapist. And the psychotherapist became the unconditional loving presence that I didn't have as a child. But then, in opening up spiritually, there's a whole different dimension that was added to that, because I didn't know at the time that I was unconditional love. I thought I needed it, but I didn't know I was that. So it's really only when we open spiritually that this love can be discovered in everything. And my sense is that this is really where the shadow fully can dissolve. Would you agree with that?
Well, yeah, let me comment on that. And so, my spirituality, it's not divorced from psychological work. I see it as one and the same. So ancient spirituality, they didn't know about psychology. They the Buddhists had some level of understanding about psychology, but the whole understanding of the shadow and what the ego really was and how it worked and how it developed. This came out with Freud, with Jung, and then of course it's continuing to grow to this day. And so I'm from a newer school of spirituality, where these two worlds are one and the same. That any movement of growth forward, whether you call it psychological healing or you're learning to exercise as an act of love to your body, you're moving one step closer, to a greater manifestation of divinity here on planet Earth. So I've always held those two together. And so I shouldn't say always, but it was, when I studied Aurobindo, that really clicked that, when you study psychology, you're studying, the intelligence of God.
Yeah, right. I just gave you this example because that was there in my own life. And, at the time I had nothing to do with spirituality. I was,
and that's how most of the world, Grace, this is the view that you described. That's how most of the world sees it. I'm trying to bring forward, a view that's highly integrated.
Yes.
Where the two they're just stepping stones. They're mutually supportive.
Mm-hmm.
Along the way. Like when we do our psychological work, we are making steps forward on the path. Absolutely. And so I see it as one and the same. And I think I agreed with everything you said, except for at the end that the shadow can dissolve. And the shadow will become We can have a shadow that's, say, just raging in our life and just creating absolute chaos. And the more we evolve, we can have a very small shadow. But, even the greatest teachers on the planet, you'll see, they get in a little bit of trouble every now and then. The greatest realized beings on the planet, get in a little bit of trouble, every now and then. And so, I wouldn't say that the shadow ever fully dissolved, or even that the ego ever fully dissolved, but it can be mostly dissolved. Like if you like great saints, they probably have very little shadow and very little ego, but more and more what we're discovering is that even the people we've honored greatly, find themselves getting in a lot of trouble. And, I don't want that to be picking on them. To me, it more just makes perfect sense that anything in this world is always going to be evolving. And so one of the ways I am devoted to God, one of the ways I bow before God is God in the form of evolution, that evolution does not stop on planet Earth, no matter how realized we are. We could always become more compassionate to ourselves and to others, to our partners. Our speech could always improve. We could always grow more and more, but we could absolutely have less shadow. And what you described is that the shadow heals through love, through strength, through clarity, through wisdom. And these are actually the same things that make, that help a child to develop. And so the same way you would raise a child, that's the same way you want to speak to your unconscious. Like if you have a big shadow around, say, sadness, a good mother, she will stop. She'll ask the child, "Are you sad? What are you sad about? What are you really sad about?" Because sometimes, the unconscious will say, "I'm sad because I didn't get my way." But if you take a deeper look, that's what shadow work is, a deeper look than "I just didn't get my way in this moment." What's this really about? Oh, you didn't feel included or loved by your community or by your friends. And so then, Grace, if we can do what you did, where you take a step in the direction of love, and you say, okay, I'm going to love this aspect of myself that feels rejected. I'm going to meet it with kindness. What happens is that psychological energy, some of it will relax, and other aspects of it will actually release through tears, through sadness, through shaking, just like, any mammal on the planet. If we're hurting, we need to shake and tremble and maybe cry and weep a little bit. That helps that energy to release. And if you notice what you're left with after a good cry, you're left with tenderness and loving kindness and compassion. And you just made a step out of ego, which ego basically says, I don't want to feel that which is uncomfortable. And you're making a step towards unconditional love, which is saying, I'm willing to feel this heartache or sadness, even if it hurts. Even if it hurts. Now, one of the things that a lot of spiritual people have done on the path, myself included, is when there's pain within us, we do what's called spiritual bypassing, which helps our shadow to increase. We look at pain within us and say, oh, that's just human stuff. I'm going to keep praying. I'm going to keep meditating, and maybe it will dissolve. And if it's something that's, not that big of a deal, it will dissolve if you sit in meditation. If it's something like a core wound within your consciousness, and you try to out-meditate it, that wound will actually revolt. You have a wonderful meditation. Maybe you have a wonderful meditation retreat that you go on. And as soon as you come home, you'll find out you'll be in an argument with your spouse, with your children, with a guy, in traffic driving slow in front of you or too fast, because again, the truth wants to come forward. It wants to be seen. If there's repressed pain within us, it wants to come out.
Mm-hmm.
And it will.
Yes,
it will.
Sure. It will. But it's interesting you bring up the spiritual bypassing, because, in my experience, there are times when it is important to really sit with something and really just allow it to, some shadow aspect. I'll give an example from my own life.
Yeah.
It's because that was very recent. There was, how do I describe that? Let's say, okay, part of my childhood, part of the pain of my childhood was that I had a lot of conflict with my older sister, who was often very angry at me. Somehow my very existence seemed to cause her anger. And it still does, actually.
Yeah.
So I recently just caused some anger to her. It's just like I can't help it. It's just what happens between us. So there is this, and because I was very sensitive as a child, I suffered a lot with being the target of anger, and so. There is a kind of habitual withdrawal from anger that happens. And these days, I'm sharing my home with a dear friend. And so I noticed that this was happening with her. And at the beginning, I was really too unconscious to notice what I put into this. I just said, well, she shouldn't get angry. Typical projection. And recently, I really just saw that I make her wrong by judging her anger, because it doesn't feel safe to me. Like her anger evokes fear in me. And so just recently, I sat with it, and I really just, there was a situation where I could see that reaction happening, and I really just sat with it, and what came was a fear of being hit, which of course, she's not going to do, but that's what happened when I was a child with my older sister. She would just have a go at me physically. And it was so interesting because, just connecting with that was so helpful, because what it allowed me to see was that I could be around my housemate's anger without being afraid.
Yeah.
I could just actually see her pain, because, there's always pain mixed in the anger. And so it was really a very new insight that, with all the healing and all the growing and all the opening and it had never happened.
Yes.
And, for myself, what I trust really is life is the biggest and perfect teacher, because it brings us the situations that invite growth, right? That invite more consciousness, more awareness, more love.
Yes.
And so, so that's the shadow work. And at the same time, I'd say sometimes it's also just a question of, if we go into one of the old kind of habits that plays out, it's also okay to just say, you know what, I'm not going there because I know this one. And, it's like, it may be a form of bypassing, but it's also actually exercising a muscle
Sure.
that isn't willing to get caught in the emotional,
Sure. That's different
machinery.
than bypassing. What you're using is right use of wisdom and discernment.
Yeah. Yeah, I
Sometimes
mean, you could
spiritual
look at that,
bypass
but
is more.
there's a fine line between that and
Yeah.
spiritual bypassing.
There absolutely is a fine line. One of the things I want to point out is, in the example you gave, you said something like life, just life is the teacher. And life is teaching us so often through our psychology. And that's why I realized at some point I can't any longer have that dividing line between psychology and spirituality, is because manifest God oftentimes comes into our life in a very intelligent way. And if you see, like with the shadow, there's an intelligence in it, that God often brings two shadows together, two shadows that are going to rub against each other in a perfect way. And we can look at it and say, well, that person is driving me crazy and they shouldn't be here. And that sounds like ego. But if we step far enough back and look at, oh, God brought me the perfect person to drive me crazy in the perfect way to bring forward my own anger.
Mm-hmm.
And if I just look at that, look at the divine play, the divine Maya, and see that Maya is intelligent. It's highly intelligent to bring two wounds together in the perfect way for the opportunity of growth. And if we don't grow this time, the beautiful thing is God gives us another opportunity again.
To come back.
Again and again. And oftentimes, if we have a really strong repressive nature that is really trying hard not to see something, then what God does is God will turn up the heat more and more and more and more. And see, that's intelligence. Mm-hmm. It's this supreme intelligence. It's one of the things that Jung would speak about, is that there was like an intelligence behind it, and it's so intelligent. It comes up in so many ways. And to me, it's beautiful. It's like beautifully orchestrated, events. Like we couldn't make this stuff up the way it comes. And, to me, what it is, it's not just about just the releasing of the emotion. It's about the gift that's buried in the shadow.
Oh, absolutely.
And that's the beauty of it. That's the beauty of it. It's shadow work. You receive something greater through doing it, a greater aspect of yourself, a greater aspect of your divinity. And so that's why, I think it's such incredible work. When I worked with anger, and I kept finding all this anger in me that I wanted to repress, the more I opened to it, let me take a step back. I had a psychological nature where I struggled with unworthiness my whole life. I was eternally apologizing for my existence anywhere I went. My teacher used to say to me, Craig, quit apologizing. Quit saying you're sorry. And I'd be like, oh, sorry. You just did it again. Quit it. Craig, own your truth. Stand in your truth. And what I had to do is, I would try to stand in my truth, but I was on shaky ground because I didn't have all my energy. There was energy that was just busy repressing my anger. But it was through giving myself permission to walk through the doorway of anger, to own my anger, to acknowledge, there's so much anger here. There's so much feeling. When I started to acknowledge that there's so much anger here, it's funny, that feeling of being unworthy started to grow into, I actually am worthy. I'm worthy of having a voice. I'm worthy of having a space here on planet Earth. I'm worthy of my own divinity. I'm worthy of speaking the truth. I'm worthy of having an opinion. But I had to walk through that doorway of anger first. And that can be a messy process, because oftentimes when we walk through the doorway of anger, when we do shadow work with anger, Oftentimes we run our mouth a little bit too much, and that's actually necessary in the beginning, just to help that energy start to empty out of us. But then eventually what we're left with, is what the Buddha called swift discerning wisdom. When you're totally comfortable with your own anger, oftentimes anger doesn't come out in a real, fierce way where we're making a fool of ourselves. Often it comes out in a way that's just like swift and discerning, like, hey, this needs to happen. And you're much more embodied. This last summer, I lived in a town where there was just forest fires everywhere. The whole place was on fire. And it was like, I live in this little neighborhood on the side of a mountain, and it was just like one big pile of pine needles ready to just catch on fire. And I was walking around my house outside, and I smelled smoke. And I know what a forest fire smoke smells like, but this smelled like a house on fire. I started running around my house, and then I looked and I saw 2 houses over, there was a house on fire. Right outside of it was a man standing there just texting, completely unaware. And so, I started yelling, and I got all the neighbors, and a lot of them were just like standing there, just like stunned. But when you're embodied, when you're able to work with your own anger, when you're willing to work with your shadow, you have all the energy available to be awake, to be alive, to be aware. And so I was ordering everyone around, get hoses, like, let's try to put this out, because it took the fire department a half hour to show up. But I was so amazed at how disembodied everyone was. They were completely spaced out and just wanted to stand and watch while me and this other fella put the fire out with garden hoses. But the more you do your shadow work, the more embodied you become. And then the more energy you have to be here, to incarnate fully on planet Earth. But when we have a big shadow, oftentimes we are checked out. One of the ways people check out is through addiction, whether it's being addicted to a cell phone or being addicted to drinking or drug use or opioid use or whatever it is. And people can get really lost, in this unconscious, I call it like consciously, unconsciously repressing, because, to some degree, alcoholism is a choice. To another degree, it's completely unconscious, and all of us do this to some degree. But like you were describing, your energy is freed up, and then you can be with your roommate, and it's like, or your housemate, and it's not a big deal if they're angry. You're not projecting. You're not struggling with them intensely. You're just admitting, okay, there's feelings here. Can I be okay with those feelings? And again, to include, say that, our true nature and the nature of awareness, true nature embodied is inclusive. It can sit with painful feelings, whether it's ours or our partners or our countries, or it's big enough to sit with it all. And so you grow spiritually when you do your psychological work. Awareness deepens, it expands, it becomes more inclusive and loving and strong.
Yeah, absolutely. So, Craig, maybe this is a good time to turn the focus over to questions. But before we do that, we'd said that maybe you do a little guided meditation to invite people to become aware of a shadow element.
Sure, absolutely.
So why don't you go ahead with that, and then because the shadow is really all about experiencing something in the moment and realizing there's something there that's I'm not quite okay with. So and the only way we know that is by feeling it. So if you do a guided meditation, that may be a good way of opening up to questions and bringing people in.
Sure. Yeah, so if everyone could just get comfortable You can close your eyes. And I'm going to invite you just to start by taking a couple of deep and full belly breaths. Just feeling your body. Feeling your heart and your belly, your throat chakra. And so because we spoke about shadow so much, I'm going to invite you just to sit with these couple questions as we're breathing and as we're going inward. What's in my shadow? What do I know that I don't want to know? Is there anything with me that I've been actively ignoring, that I've been avoiding? Sometimes it's a little anxious feeling in our chest, our throat, our belly. What's within me? Is there any childlike places that feel hurt, or I felt ignored or denied? Is there any feelings of guilt or shame, sadness or anger? So I'm just going to invite you just to take a couple deep, full breaths. Just to breathe into those feelings. To give yourself permission to see them, to acknowledge them. The most loving, non-judgmental way. So just feeling what's within you. And so from this place of feeling, I'm going to invite you to imagine that that feeling could become personified into a being, perhaps, like a little girl or a little boy version of yourself. They're just sitting in front of you. And in the most loving way, just looking into her eyes, looking into his eyes. Acknowledging their pain, their sadness, their heartache, whatever it is. Their anger. In the most loving way. I'm going to invite you just to ask that presence that's within you. What is it? What is it that you want? And they might say something like, I want this thing or that thing, or someone to see me, or whatever it is. Then you just ask it again, but what do you really want? What do you really need? What is it you truly need? So that you can heal. So that you can feel loved again and included. And so whatever that is, that this energy within you, this little boy or little girl or this being, whatever it truly wants, whether it be love or safety or greater sense of freedom or just to be seen or embraced, let us give it that. Let's breathe more fully into this aspect of ourself that is hurting. Let us give it the love that it needs or wants. Let us embrace it fully. You can just take a couple more deep breaths, just doing this, just breathing in and out, just loving this aspect of ourselves that has felt rejected for so long. And then we can just ask it one more question. Is there any truth that you want to show me? Is there a buried gift here in this experience? Is there any wisdom that's been buried that wants to come forward? Is there an old memory that just wants to be seen and acknowledged so that it can be released, so that we don't have to carry it any longer within us? So we'll just take a couple more deep, full belly breaths. Just breathing and feeling and acknowledging. And of course, if there's more layers to this pain, more layers to this shadow or unconsciousness, you can let your body know, let your heart know that you're willing to do this work more often. You're willing to be more kind and listening and gentle with yourself. You're going to make a commitment to seeing more, to loving more, to embracing more that which is within you. Trusting that it's okay to breathe, to see, to feel. So you can take a couple more deep, full breaths, allowing any of the energy to release or let go, allowing any of the truth or the gift to integrate more fully. And then when you're ready, you can just gently open your eyes. And then, of course, like Grace was saying, if you have a question, or I guess for Grace or I, about your experience or about what we are speaking about, now's your time to speak, to share, just to offer something.
Thanks, Greg.
Yeah.
That's beautiful. So is there anybody who wants to ask a question? Let's see. Judy wants to speak. Okay, Judy, I'll unmute you. There you are.
Hi, that was wonderful. I really appreciate that guided meditation, because that was going to be my question. And it remains. Doing shadow work, do I just do it as something arises that feels like it's shadow and it's ready to be looked at, or how does that work?
Yeah, Judy, that's a great question. Traditionally, shadow work, because it's nature, is it's helpful to do it with a skilled counselor or therapist, because one of the definitions of shadow is it's that which is in our unconsciousness that we cannot see. Now, if we're like a rock, we might not be able to see our shadow. But most of you, they're semi-awake, are going to be able to see some level of their shadow. So I don't always like that definition, meaning it's like completely in our blind spot. But yeah, it's helpful to have, you know, a partner, a guide, you know, like with the short meditation I did. Sometimes when I'm working with students or clients, we might spend, you know, 45 minutes, you know, just doing this one meditation. We really go into it. And so I'll ask the questions and they'll, you know, respond. And then I'll ask deeper questions to help them go more fully into it. And once you get the hang of it, then, yeah, it's nice just to start doing it on our own, you know, and of course, anyone can do it on their own. You know, the beautiful thing about life is always speaking to us, you know. And so if we have a husband, if we have a partner, if we have kids, if we have, you know, sometimes it's the way our dog looks at us, where, you know, our dog's like whining because we're ignoring him. And it's like, you know, we can ask, do I just ignore my dog and just see him as the old, you know, dog, or is there something in me that's ignoring life, has myself closed off, you know, to life, you know? And so life will always talk to you. If we're driving down the road and we have road rage a lot, you know, at some point in our maturity, we have to stop blaming the other drivers. You know, we just say, this rage, it's so painful. Maybe I need to look inward at myself. And so, but traditionally, you start, you know, this work when you meet with someone like me or Grace, you know, who's trained in it, and it can be helpful. Of course, I'm sure there's plenty of books on it, but I like to have a daily practice that I worked with. I trained with a Tibetan Buddhist teacher, and she trained me in this shadow work called feeding your demons. And so, you know, I did that exercise like, I don't know, 500 or 800 times, just looking and just kept finding more and more things within me. And it wasn't that I just found more pain. I found more aspects of my own divinity that were buried within me. Wow. And it was really incredible work to do that. I mean, I still do that work, of course. But yeah, it can be helpful to have a support along the way. But by all means, it's also very efficient to do it on your own as well. I like to do both.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Sometimes a good therapist or teacher will point something out to us, and you know, our husband may have been saying that to us for 10 years, but when the teacher says it, we're like, oh yeah, maybe there's something here. Maybe there's something here. You know, sometimes our kids say something to us like, hey, you know, mom or dad, you're being a little mean or grumpy. I'm not grumpy. It's not me. It's you. You know, it's like, oh yeah, maybe I am being grumpy. Maybe that's what's going on. And so if you listen, life is always pointing out our shadows. That's the beautiful thing that Grace was speaking about before. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So Judy, I just add maybe to what Craig said, you know, there's a place for doing this work ourselves, and there's a place for working with somebody, you know. If you're not used to doing this work yourself, if, you know, you don't have a history of that, what happens easily is that, you know, you start and then, you know, the forces, the psychological forces that make you disconnect and not go to places that are painful, they set in very quickly. You know, it's like you need to develop a kind of an awareness of when you're still there with whatever it is that's in the shadow and that's coming up, and when you're disconnecting. When you're disconnecting, you know, if you're used to doing this work, you can then just reconnect. You know, you get aware, you become aware that, oh, I'm okay, yeah, I've kind of like stopped going there, right? Yeah. So then you can invite yourself back into it. And often when you're not used to that kind of work, you'll stop very quickly and you won't get anywhere. And a therapist or teacher will help you come back to it over and over and over, because that's the muscle that needs to be trained at the beginning. So you'll see for yourself how far you get. If you don't get very far, it's probably a good idea to work with somebody. But if you feel like, you know, there's stuff that comes up and you're able to see it and it's you know, it's productive for you, then by all means have a go by yourself.
Thanks.
Yeah. You're welcome. So I see another question. Angelica, I'm unmuting you. Hold on. Okay. I don't seem to be able to. Yeah, now you are unmuted.
Great, thanks very much. First of all, I just want to say thank you to both you, Grace, and also to Greg for making that space and that time for us today to look at this a little bit deeper. I'm really grateful for that. You were speaking, Grace, just now, part of my question you were sort of kind of answering, or about the psychological, you mentioned psychological forces that kind of disconnect us. And that was one of my questions is to you and to Craig, is about how I can, I do have willingness to do the work, and I have had all my life, and I've been doing the work, but there's two things happening here. I'm not quite sure how consistent my willingness is. And I am very aware of my habitual tendencies that seem to be maybe the psychological forces that you're talking about, which are taken over and delay or kind of disrupt the process. So that this aspect. So my first question is, how can I strengthen or make my willingness more consistent? Because I do know sometimes things can get really tough and I feel I want to break from it all. So that's the first question. And the other question is, there are areas of aspects of work. I've done quite deep work within myself, and I've been looking at some of the shadow side areas in myself. And I thought or felt that I had been doing a lot of healing work, and it created a lot of energy, and my life changed. And then at some stage, it seems to be coming around in cycles, where I know I have been evolving. Greg, you were speaking about evolutionary universe, and we are there's an evolution going on within us. The bit about you know, it feels like, you know, I've been.
Oh, we lost you there.
Maybe.
Okay, I've unmuted Angelica. Are you still here?
I am, yes. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, we can hear you. It's like you.
Okay.
Hold on.
It's just
Your video is gone. Let me see whether I can bring your video back.
what's happened.
Hello, Angelica.
It says you are unmuted by host.
Yes, that's right. So we can hear you. Your video is still gone.
Okay, I don't know why that is.
But that's all right. We can just continue with the recording.
Okay, that's great.
Mm-hmm.
It's just that the second question was, oh, here we start my video. Here we go. So
There you are.
The second question was that it seemed to have done some healing work, and then what happens is the same issue seems to come back in a different form. And I just wondered whether you could talk a little bit about, whether does that mean I really haven't done the healing work yet, or is that something that is normal,
Yes. Yes, Angelica, this is a very common question. And, one of the things that life is asking for you is for you to develop faith, a greater trust, a greater strength, a greater willingness. And so life is challenging you and saying, how deep do you want to go? How deep do you want to heal? When we have these wounds within us, if we do the work, say, a little bit, that is absolutely helpful. But I like to look at all of our wounds within us as like children. Children don't need a little bit of love. They need eternal love. They need us to show up again and again and again and again and again. And as we do so, we deepen in the experience of unconditional love. We deepen in it. And so, as a parent, it can be tiring. It can be exhausting. So when you said, there's times I just want to take a little bit of a break, and it's like, yeah, by all means, give yourself a nice bubble bath, or go get a massage, or go for a walk in the park, or whatever is, gentle or loving, for you. But the nature of, our shadow, the nature of our unconsciousness is there's many layers to it. So when I say I worked with anger, I've worked with anger for 20 years. I didn't just work with it once and have a nice meditation and afterwards released and I was all healed. I continue to work with my shadow. I continue to work with it. And what happens is after you get to like a certain point, the work doesn't exhaust you anymore. It actually feels liberating. It feels like, oh my God, like what a relief it is for me just to stop and to look and be like, oh yeah, I see. What I say is I see another layer of this. Mm-hmm. What the human mind does is oftentimes it'll say, it thinks in like cyclical ways, but I like to look evolutionary. We're going deeper, wider, fuller, then deeper, wider, fuller. And so there's more layers to things. And so when you see that with each layer, you liberate the energy and you discover a greater aspect of love. And you learn a greater aspect of willingness, a greater aspect of sincerity, greater aspect of forgiveness, a greater aspect of, surrender or, strength or trust. And so please don't lose faith, in this work, because when you lose faith in doing healing work, what you're actually doing is you're looking at your inner child and saying, I'll do a little bit of work, but I'm not going to do all the work because I'm tired. I've had enough of you. You drive me crazy. I'm over it. And so, what our unconscious needs is unconditional love. And that's what this work does, is it helps you grow into something greater. And so, sometimes in the beginning, like Grace was saying, it could be helpful to meet with a therapist. Like when I first met with my therapist, I'd have these big release and I'd be like, oh, I'm great. I feel so good. And then he'd look at me and he'd say, see you next week. And I was like, what the hell are we going to talk about next week? I feel I'm healed, right? Like, aren't I better? And he's like, I'll see you next week, Craig. And I was like, what do you mean? Like, come on, I'm done. And, I learned over the years that, it's good to just keep going back, to the work. One of my teachers and colleagues, Mariana Kaplan, she says, it's good to do like a good course of therapy at every stage of development. Like when you go through, a different stage of development, to dive, deeply back in, because there'll be actually new shadows, new wounds that arise at different places, along the journey. When I, kind of had my, whatever they call that, midlife crisis, I guess. Is that what they call it? Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yes. When I had that, I realized, oh, like what's going on here? I'm getting a motorcycle and, I'm listening to the Grateful Dead again. I'm questioning my existence for the next, 40 or 50 years. Like what, all these other wounds started coming forward about where I was in life and I thought, oh, okay, I could do some work here too. And so it's good. I'll just say one more thing. The tendency, like Grace was describing, just to kind of stay at one place or to resort back to the norm, that's the tendency of habit. And so when God created this world, she created two great movements. One was a movement to evolve, and one was a movement of habit. Habit's a wonderful energy. It keeps everything together. It makes sure that our cells repeat themselves in the same way, so that we can form a body and not just be like a blob of cells that oozes all over the place. It's important to have habit. Habit makes sure that you brush your teeth every day, and you know what time it is to go to work and this and that. But the shadow side of habit is you don't grow. You just kind of plateau and stay in the same place. And so we always have these two forces that we're working with: the force of habit, just repeating the past, like I saw that I was repeating what my father was doing, in my own life. I was like, oh, I'm repeating my ancestors. Okay. But that keeps the tribal consciousness intact. It keeps it so we're not, all too crazy and wild. But then, if we all just stay there, then the world doesn't grow. So then there's the force of evolution. It's important to honor both appropriately.
Okay.
Yeah, so don't feel bad at, that you had the force of habit take over. You and the rest of the planet, myself included, have the force of habit within us. It's a normal thing. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you for that question. I just add to what Craig said that actually two things. One is that there is this, there's so many healing modalities these days that promise that you can be done with something once and for all. That's it. If you do that kind of healing, then that's it. You'll be rid of your problem. And that's that's just not true. I agree with Craig that especially when you're on a spiritual path and your life is dedicated to the divine, then it's like you're going to grow for the rest of your life. You're going to heal for the rest of your life. And if you've done your personal healing, you start healing the human psyche, the collective psyche. And you can do it at a pace that's okay for you, and you can take time out. But don't expect to ever be finished, because to me, that's the beauty of a life that's given to God, that's given to the light, to love, is that we just become a force of love. And love calls everything to it that's not healed, that's not fully seen, that's not fully awake and aware. So as far as I can see, that just keeps going on. And that's the beauty of that kind of life, is that, it just keeps happening, and it gets easier with time. It's not as difficult and strenuous and demanding when you're 10 or 20 years into this than when you're at the beginning. So you can also trust that it does get easier and easier.
Okay. Thank you.
And thank you for, thank you for giving yourself to that.
Yeah, it's no other way.
It's really not our choice in the end, is it?
Yeah. It's a process to surrender to.
Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Oh, that's so touching. Let's see whether there's anybody else that wants to ask a question. Do you see any more hands that are being raised? Okay, looks like for now it's complete. Craig, is there anything that you want to maybe add to what's been said that feels like it still needs to be put out there?
Yeah. Let me just look here. I took some notes, which I normally don't do, but I thought I'd just write a couple of things down to make sure I said. One of the ways that we can just look for shadows in our body is, if you have addiction, what you've done is you've given your power away. You've given your power away to something else. And so, when we work with our addictive tendency, we're getting our power back. We're getting our power back. Oftentimes, almost always addiction has to do with shadow and giving the power away. And there's been also a lot of research that show that, there's been certain forms of allergies that arise from having a big shadow. When you have a big shadow, basically you're using a lot of energy to repress pain in your body. And your body oftentimes mimics your psychology. And so when you're repressing life, when you're repressing energy, it's very similar to what an allergy does. An allergy is a body fighting itself, fighting itself. And that was always interesting to me to see that. If you practice yoga and you notice that your body is very rigid, that's your body telling you, hey, there's a shadow here. It's a big shadow here. And so sometimes you'll feel the shadows literally in your body. If your jaw is clenched, oftentimes that means there's an issue in the throat chakra. The throat chakra is in charge of expression. But if it's clenched, oftentimes our throat chakra is repressing. It's one of the seats of our superego. And so I have been eternally amazed at how the shadow shows up psychosomatically. Some of us have a really big belly. And the reason we have a big belly is because there's a wound within us, a shadow of a feeling of unworthiness or, that we don't feel safe here on planet Earth. So we self-soothe through eating. So we're stuffing the belly. We're just like, feeding our shadow. And of course, that's, not healthy if we're overeating. But another way we do shadow work is through practicing yoga, through doing, just really body-based, like meditation practices or exercises. Oftentimes, if you think you don't have a shadow and you might, go try something silly like being Rolfed, which is like a really intense form of a massage. A good Rolfer in sometimes 2 minutes can can unearth, some deep shadows within you where you held old pain or repressed it into your cellular memory, So to me, it's really interesting how the body holds and stores shadows or stores unconscious energy within itself. Sometimes cancer, which is like if you look at it energetically, it can be a form of energy like festering anger, oftentimes manifest into cancer cells. And so to me, it's really important. It's literally, sometimes we'll save your life to do shadow work. It can save your life, literally. And not only does it save your life, but it will give you a new life where you can truly have a chance to let go of these burdens that so many of us carry and step into our God-given true nature which is lighthearted, which is loving, which is spacious and free and tender and vast and radiantly, luminate. We're not meant here just to be like, our human body is meant to be a temple. It's not meant to be a stuffing or like a dumping ground of everything bad and wrong or difficult that's happened to us. When you teach a child that it's okay to cry, it's okay to feel, it's okay to be yourself, it's okay to do, what you truly want in the world, you're teaching that child to live more closely in alignment with their true nature, with their gifts, with their divinity. If you teach a kid to shut up and keep quiet, and what's that old saying? Children should be seen, not heard. When we teach them that, kids become really neurotic. And oftentimes they grow up and have addictions or, really, neurotic psychology. And it's really sad when I see that as a parent, that, there's so much that we can do for each other. We can love our partners more fully. We can love ourselves more fully. And so we truly can heal in greater and greater ways, when we do this work. And I'm going to say one last thing, and this one normally, upsets a lot of people, is that our human consciousness, like our human species, has this great shadow. Like one of the shadows we have is we are ignoring the earth and just living in a radically materialistic way. And our earth it's violently speaking to us, whether it's with forest fires or flooding or islands disappearing. And, in our country, in the United States, we have one group, saying it's not a problem at all. And then another group not actually doing much about the problem, but just blaming the government or blaming corporations. And like our whole planet is struggling with this shadow of a potential, mass extinction. We're losing more species now than we've ever lost. And besides when like the great comet hit or meteorite or whatever. And so many of us are just ignoring this. And so this work, it's not just good for ourselves. It's good for our community. It's good for our family. It's good for our children. It's good for the planet and how we all treat each other. It's a necessity that we do this work, that we wake up and really, start to be honest about what's within us, what's happening around us. We're at a moment in history where our life depends upon it. Our life depends upon it. And I hope that doesn't sound as stark. I would rather it seem as, oh yeah, like this is good. This is good to do this. It's good not just to watch TV all day. It's good to, to do this healing work. It benefits everyone, future generations. As you do your shadow work, then the children of the future, they don't have to suffer the hells, the sins of their fathers and mothers. Yeah. And so to me, it's such a great thing to be a part of. It's a tremendous gift of love you give to yourself and all of creation to do this work.
That's beautiful, Craig. Thank you. There's one last question.
Yeah, sure.
I'm going to unmute Angelica. Go ahead. Oops. I don't see. Yeah, there you go.
Hi. Actually, it's funny how it works. I had a question and then Craig answered it. So, but thanks very much. Really, I'm totally. My heart is totally committed to the process, and has been for a long time. It's just it's staying with it, consistently. Yeah. That's a bit which I need to do. And there are areas I am very aware today, and also through the meditation that we did with you, Craig, is that you were talking about psychosomatic kind of symptoms, the illnesses. And I have a lot, and I don't know whether this is because I'm now in menopause and, you know, that time of life in a woman's life. I don't know, but I have a lot of those. And when I go to the doctor, they just don't know what to do with me because I'm the healthiest person they've got in the practice. All the tests are fine. But there are these psychosomatic illnesses, and I'm just wondering how to best work with this, how to communicate with those symptoms. What are they telling me? How can I work with that? I know there's problems with my stomach, and my stomach is telling me a story. What is it that I'm needing to listen to? You know, there's a solar plexus issues, kind of, etc. What is it that I'm needing to listen to? You know, how can I listen to these symptoms, you know, that are there? What are they telling me?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm glad you asked that because that was one of the things I was supposed to talk about today. So thank you. So the first thing I'll say is
to say, not to interrupt here, but we're over time, so
yeah.
let's keep it relatively
Sure. I'll be quick. So two things. When we're on the path, it can be difficult. And so oftentimes I'll just ask God to come into me, to hold me, to give me the strength to do this work, to give me the strength to listen, to give me the strength to heal. And so that's one of the big things I do is just invite God to talk to me. And sometimes God will talk to you in dreams. Sometimes God will talk to you when you're driving down the road. You see this old vision from the past of something you need to love. Another thing I do is just spend a lot of time in silence, especially if you have psychosomatic symptoms, to lay down in bed or on a yoga mat, and to hold the place in your body like it was a child, and just ask it, what's this pain about? What's this about? And then you just gently listen. And sometimes your body will speak to you with an image, an old memory. You know, and your body may tell you this is purely menopause. You know, sometimes it's just purely a physical thing, but oftentimes our body will show us an old repressed memory from the past. And so we just allow that to come forward. And whatever it is, you meet it with love, with kindness. And I like to imagine you holding the pain, and then even sometimes imagine the Divine Mother holding you, giving you the strength to do this work so that it doesn't have to feel like it's me against life, me saving the world, but rather it's a radical act of humility and love.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Craig. That's it's been very beautiful, and I'm glad we spent this time with the shadow and exploring just how important this willingness is to include the shadow and to allow it to give us its gifts.
Yes.
Because that's really in the end what it's all about. And thank you so much for for being with us and bringing your perspective and your experience. And if you like to get in touch with Craig, his website is craigholliday.com. And if you've appreciated this event and our exchange, I'm also open to donations to support these online events, the Living from Love online events. You can make a donation on the website. And we'll see you again soon. Thank you to all of you for being here.
Thank you.
Your questions. And be well. Blessings to all of you.